My parents raised their crystal flutes, laughing as my father called me a waste of space in front of 200 wealthy guests at their 30th anniversary. 3 years later, I stood in that same ballroom, holding the power of life and death over the empire they built on lies, as the auction hammer slammed down, selling their legacy. I locked eyes with them and whispered, "Now, who is the one taking up space?" My name is Elena Sterling, and standing in the ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel in Chicago, I felt less like a daughter and more like a stain on the silk tablecloth. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of 200 of the city's elite, all gathered to celebrate the 30th wedding anniversary of my parents, Robert and Linda Sterling. I was 28 years old, a forensic accountant who spent her days buried in spreadsheets, and to them, I was utterly invisible. I stood in the corner, clutching my clutch, acutely aware that my off-the-rack dress was a dull navy against the sea of designer sequins. Then the doors swung open, and the atmosphere shifted. Kevin, my 30-year-old brother, made his entrance. He had arrived in a rented supercar that roared loud enough to shake the valet stand, immediately launching into a loud monologue about his startup, Nebula Tech. Everyone fawned over him, desperate to get in on the ground floor of what was essentially a vaporware company. Kevin basked in the attention, his smile bright and practiced, the golden child who could do no wrong. When it was time for gifts, I stepped forward nervously. My hands shook as I presented a small velvet envelope. Inside was a savings book containing $50,000, money I had spent 5 years scraping together by skipping lunches and working weekends so they could finally take that dream trip to Europe. My mother took it, glanced at the balance, and let out a scoff that sounded like a cough. She tossed it onto a side table as if it were a used napkin. "It is sweet," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, but hardly appropriate for the occasion. "Elena," Kevin stepped up next. With a flourish, he unveiled a solid gold statue of a lion, roaring in triumph. The room gasped. I knew for a fact he had purchased it using a credit card he had quietly opened in our father's name, but the crowd saw only generosity. My father beamed, clapping Kevin on the back so hard the boy nearly stumbled. Robert Sterling tapped his spoon against his champagne flute, silencing the room. He raised his glass, his face flushed with pride and vintage wine. He spent 10 minutes extolling Kevin's visionary mind and his bright future. Then, his gaze drifted to me. The warmth vanished from his eyes. He chuckled darkly and said, loudly enough for the waiters in the back to hear, "Some kids make you proud. Others just take up space." The laughter was immediate. It rippled through the room, a wave of cruel amusement. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Kevin, who was raising his glass in a mock toast to me, a smirk playing on his lips. My mother just stared at me with cold, flat eyes, as if daring me to make a scene. A distant relative, Aunt Margaret, reached out to touch my arm, murmuring a soft apology. But my mother intercepted the gesture. She swatted Margaret's hand away and hissed that I was embarrassing the family by wearing such a ragged dress to a black tie event. I could not breathe. The humiliation was a physical weight in my chest. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor as I headed for the exit. I needed to find a bathroom, a closet, anywhere to hide until the burning in my eyes stopped. As I passed the heavy oak doors of the private lounge near the cloakroom, I heard voices. They were hushed but furious. I froze. It was my father and Kevin. "We are drowning," Robert hissed. "The banks are calling every hour. That gold statue was a mistake. Kevin, it was an investment in image." "Dad," Kevin shot back. "Look, we just need a bridge loan. We need collateral. We have nothing left to leverage." My mother's voice joined them, sharp and panicked. "Unless we find a scapegoat, someone with a clean record to take on the toxic debt." I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. They were not just mean, they were desperate. I slipped away before they could see me, pushing through the revolving doors and out into the biting Chicago winter. The wind hit me like a slap, freezing the tears on my cheeks. I stood on the sidewalk, shivering in my thin dress, looking back at the golden glow of the hotel windows. That was the last time I would ever let them make me feel small. I turned my back on the Grand Plaza and walked into the darkness. 2 weeks after the disaster at the Grand Plaza, a knock on my door shattered the silence of my Saturday morning. I opened it to find Robert and Linda standing in the dim hallway of my cramped apartment building, holding a basket of imported fruit and looking utterly out of place. Their expressions were not the sneers I remembered from the gala. They were soft, filled with a penitence I had never seen before. "Can we come in?" "Elena," my mother asked, her voice trembling. I stepped aside, confused and wary. They sat on my second-hand sofa, looking uncomfortable amidst my modest furniture. Then the performance began. My father, usually a pillar of arrogance and strength, slumped his shoulders. He told me he had been diagnosed with severe heart failure. He needed immediate surgery, a procedure that cost a fortune, but their liquid assets were currently frozen due to a complex overseas investment merger. They were cash poor and desperate. My mother grabbed my hands, her eyes welling with tears that looked frighteningly real. "We were so cruel to you," she sobbed. "Stress made us monsters. Please, Elena, do not let your father die because of our pride." I felt my resolve cracking, despite the years of neglect, despite the humiliation at the party. The biological pull was strong. I was starved for this sudden affection, however suspicious it seemed. Just as I was about to ask for more details about the procedure, Kevin burst through the door. He was not wearing his usual pristine designer suit, but a disheveled shirt, acting the part of the frantic son perfectly. "Thank God you are here," he panted, pulling a thick stack of documents from a leather satchel. I found a loophole. "Dad, we can get the surgery scheduled for tomorrow if we secure a temporary guarantor for the medical bridge loan." He shoved the papers onto my coffee table, scattering the coasters. "It is just a formality." "Elena," he said, clicking a pen and thrusting it at me. "It just says you are vouching for us until the funds unlock on Monday." I picked up the paperwork. The text was dense, filled with legal jargon about collateral, liability, and asset transfer. I tried to read the fine print, my accountant brain sensing a discrepancy in the terminology, but my mother let out a wail of despair, clutching her chest. Kevin slammed his hand on the table, startling me. "There is no time to read every line," Elena Kevin shouted, his face inches from mine, sweat beading on his forehead. "Do you want him to have a heart attack right here? Sign the damn paper." My father let out a ragged, convincing cough. Panic overrode logic. With a shaking hand, I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the dotted line. I did not know I was signing away the trust fund my grandmother had secretly left me. I did not know I was accepting full liability for a massive line of credit attached to my Social Security number. The moment the ink dried, the temperature in the room dropped. Kevin snatched the papers back, checking the signature with a cold precision. My mother stopped crying instantly, wiping her face with a terrifying efficiency. "We need to get to the hospital," my father said, his voice suddenly steady and strong as he stood up without assistance. They left without a hug, without a thank you, the door clicking shut on their heels. A month of silence followed. I tried to convince myself they were busy with recovery. Then, the first blow landed. I was called into my boss's office and told that my promotion to senior accountant was denied. My background check had flagged a catastrophic drop in my credit score, making me a liability for the firm. Confused and terrified, I called my parents, but the calls went straight to voicemail. I drove to their estate, expecting a somber house of recovery. Instead, music blasted from the driveway. Balloons bobbed in the wind. I parked down the street and walked up, peering through the iron hedges. There was Kevin, laughing, spraying champagne over a brand-new sports car. My father stood next to him, smoking a cigar, looking healthier than he had in years. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an alert from my bank, followed by a certified email. I opened it, my knees giving way as I sank onto the cold pavement outside their gate. It was a demand for payment. I was the primary borrower on a defaulted business loan for Nebula Tech. The outstanding balance was $500,000. I stormed past the startled housekeeper and burst into the main parlor of the Sterling estate. The scene before me was a grotesque parody of the tragedy they had enacted just weeks prior. My father, the man who was supposedly on death's door with a failing heart, was standing by the fireplace, swirling a glass of scotch and laughing heartily at something on the television. My mother was flipping through a bridal magazine, and Kevin was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through his phone. They looked up as I entered, but there was no guilt in their eyes, only annoyance. "You are not dying," I whispered, the rage making my voice shake. Robert took a slow sip of his drink. "Miraculous recovery, isn't it?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I turned to Kevin. "You stole my identity. You put $500,000 of debt in my name." Kevin didn't even look up from his phone. "I leveraged your credit for Nebula Tech. It is called business. Elena." "It wasn't business," I screamed, slamming the default notice onto the coffee table. "The bank says the money went to casinos in Vegas and luxury car rentals. You gambled it away." Kevin shrugged, finally meeting my gaze with a bored expression. "Startups are risky. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. You just happened to lose." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to defend me, to show a shred of the maternal instinct she had faked so well in my apartment. Instead, Linda closed her magazine with a sharp snap. "Stop shouting. Elena, you are his sister. Sacrificing for your brother is your duty. Kevin is the future of this dynasty. You are just a mid-level employee. If you have to go bankrupt to ensure his success, then that is the role you were born to play." I gasped, backing away. "I am going to the police. I will tell them everything. The fake illness, the coercion." Robert laughed. A cold, dry sound. "Go ahead. The doctor who diagnosed me, he doesn't exist. The medical records, shredded. As far as the law is concerned, you came here, saw we needed capital, and generously signed as a guarantor. It is your signature. Elena, you volunteered." Before I could respond, the front door opened, and the housekeeper threw a battered suitcase onto the driveway. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is the rest of your things we had in storage," my father said, turning his back on me. "Kevin is preparing to propose to Isabella, the daughter of a real estate tycoon. We cannot have a bankrupt, hysterical sister dragging down his reputation. You are disowned. Elena. Do not contact us again." I was physically pushed out the door. The heavy oak slammed shut, and the lock clicked, sealing my fate. The downward spiral was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, my landlord evicted me because my credit rating had tanked, violating the terms of my lease. My bank accounts were frozen by the creditors. I stood on the street corner in the biting wind of a Chicago winter, a homeless woman with nothing but a suitcase of old clothes and a mountain of debt. For 3 nights, I slept in the back seat of my rusting sedan, parked in a dark alley to avoid police patrols. The cold was agonizing. It seeped into my bones, making my teeth chatter uncontrollably. I stared up at the illuminated skyscrapers of the city, the glass towers where people like my parents lived in warmth and comfort, and I felt a loneliness so profound it nearly killed me. I wanted to close my eyes and never wake up, but then the memory of the anniversary party flashed in my mind. I saw my father's face, heard the laughter of the crowd as he called me a waste of space. Something inside me snapped, not a break, but a hardening. If I died here, I would prove him right. I would just be a frozen body taking up space in a landfill. I sat up, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. No, I would not die. I would become the disaster they never saw coming. The next morning, I drove to a pawn shop. I sold the car for $1,200. I sold my mother's old locket, the only thing she had ever given me, for $200 more. With the cash, I rented a damp, windowless room in a basement in the worst part of town. I bought a second-hand laptop and instant noodles. I did not look for another standard accounting job. Instead, I used my remaining funds to enroll in an advanced certification course for forensic accounting. I studied with a manic intensity, fueled by hatred. I learned how to track hidden assets, how to unravel shell companies, and how to find the digital fingerprints that arrogant men like my brother always left behind. 6 months later, I typed up a cover letter. I did not send it to a bank or a corporate firm. I sent it to Apex Horizon Solutions, a shadowy financial consultancy known for destroying corruption from the inside out. I was done being the victim. It was time to become the hunter. Getting hired at Apex Horizon Solutions was not like walking through a door. It was like scaling a sheer glass wall without ropes. I started at the very bottom as a junior analyst, a ghost in a machine of high-stakes finance. For the first 6 months, I did not see the sun. I worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, fueled by black coffee and a cold, hard rage that never settled. I volunteered for the tasks no one else wanted, diving into the chaotic, tangled webs of offshore accounts and shell corporations until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. My relentless intensity eventually caught the eye of Victoria Vance. She was a legend in Chicago, known as the Iron Lady of Finance, a woman who could crumble a CEO's ego with a single raised eyebrow. One night, she found me alone in the office at 2 a.m. She did not ask me why I was working so hard. She simply looked into my eyes, saw the fire burning there, and nodded. Victoria became my mentor, though she taught me far more than accounting. She taught me that forensic auditing was psychological warfare. She showed me how to read the micro-expressions of a liar, how to find the desperation hidden between the lines of a quarterly report, and how to wield the tax code like a surgeon's scalpel. Under her tutelage, I learned that the law was not a shield to protect the innocent, but a weapon to gut the guilty. As my mind sharpened, so did my image. The trembling girl in the cheap navy dress was dead. I cut my hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed my face like armor. I replaced my ragged wardrobe with bespoke suits in charcoal, black, and blood red. I learned to walk with a rhythmic, authoritative click of my heels that made heads turn, and when I spoke, I no longer asked for permission. I gave orders. Over the next 2 years, I became a phantom in the financial world. I single-handedly dismantled 3 major embezzlement rings in rival corporations, recovering millions of dollars for our clients. The industry began to whisper about a money hunter at Apex, a faceless auditor who could smell fraud from a mile away. But I kept my identity strictly guarded. I needed the shadows for what I was planning. While I climbed the corporate ladder, I kept a constant digital watch on the Sterling family. Kevin was playing the role of the visionary tech mogul to perfection. He was currently engaged to Isabella, the only daughter of a massive real estate tycoon. It looked like the perfect union of technology and old money. But I dug deeper. I accessed public records and obscure financial filings, piecing together the truth. Kevin was running a classic Ponzi scheme. He was using new investor money to pay off old gambling debts and maintain his lavish facade for Isabella. Even more pathetic was the state of my parents. I discovered they had taken out a second and third mortgage on the family estate. They were pouring every last cent into Kevin's black hole of a company, gambling their entire existence on this marriage. They believed that once Kevin married Isabella, her family's fortune would cover his losses and restore their glory. Then, the universe handed me the knife. I was promoted to Senior Audit Director of Mergers and Acquisitions, a position of immense power. 2 days later, a request came in from Isabella's father. He was a shrewd businessman who wanted a complete independent financial audit of Nebula Tech before he allowed the companies to merge. He wanted the best, So we hired Apex Horizon. I sat in my corner office, staring at the file with my brother's name on it. I picked up my pen and smiled. The trap was set. I accepted the Nebula Tech case file under the alias E.R. Sterling. It was a simple administrative choice, or so it seemed on paper, allowing me to remain a ghost in the machine until the moment was right to strike. I dispatched my most aggressive team of junior auditors to Kevin's headquarters with strict instructions to be ruthless. They descended upon his startup like a swarm of locusts, demanding invoices for every coffee purchased and cross-referencing every transaction made in the last 3 years. From the safety of my office at Apex Horizon, I monitored the chaos. I had authorized the installation of high-fidelity listening devices in Kevin's conference room, disguised as standard smoke detectors during a routine building inspection I had ordered days prior. Through my noise-canceling headphones, I listened to the sweet sound of my brother unraveling. "They are killing me!" "Dad," Kevin screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with panic. "They are asking for the vendor lists for the prototype development. The prototypes do not exist." I listened as my father, Robert, responded with his trademark arrogance. "Calm down, Kevin. Everyone has a price. Just offer the lead auditor a consultation fee. A nice, heavy envelope usually makes these problems disappear." I let out a cold, sharp laugh in the empty room. They had not changed at all. They still believed money could fix the rot they had created. It was time to show them that some stains could not be bought off. I scheduled a mandatory in-person review with the board of directors of Nebula Tech. Since it was a family-run sham, the board consisted entirely of Kevin, Robert, and Linda. They arrived at the Apex Horizon Tower looking nervous but determined, clutching their briefcases, which I assumed contained the bribe money my father had suggested. They were led into Conference Room B, a glass-walled aquarium where I could watch them sweat for 10 minutes before I made my entrance. When I finally pushed open the heavy glass doors, the room went silent. The air conditioning hummed, loud and oppressive. I was wearing a blood-red suit that cost more than their current car, and my hair was sharp enough to cut glass. I walked to the head of the table and placed my leather folio down with a deliberate thud. "Good morning," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of warmth. Kevin dropped his pen. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's eyes bulged as if he were seeing a ghost. "Elena," Kevin whispered, his face draining of color. "You work here." I did not smile. "I am the senior audit director. Kevin, and you are in a lot of trouble." Robert recovered first, his face turning a deep, angry red. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is absurd. You are the one harassing my son. You are just a bitter, jealous little girl trying to sit down." "Robert," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. I tossed a thick file onto the polished mahogany table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of him. "That is a forensic breakdown of your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It details $3 million of misappropriated investor funds, tax evasion, and wire fraud. I can have the FBI here in 10 minutes. Robert collapsed back into his chair. The fight went out of him instantly. My mother, ever the chameleon, immediately switched tactics. Her eyes filled with those familiar manipulative tears. "Elena, please," she wailed, reaching across the table as if to grab my hand. "We are family. Your brother made a mistake. He is young. We can work this out. We will give you shares in the company. 10%. No, 20%. You can be rich. Darling, just make this report go away." I looked at them, analyzing their desperation. They were pathetic. I pretended to mull over the offer, tapping a manicured fingernail against the glass table. "I do not want your money," I said slowly. "Your shares are worthless because your company is a fraud. However, I might be persuaded to delay filing my official report for 1 week. Hope flared in Kevin's eyes. "Anything, Elena. Name it. I want an invitation to your engagement party. I said, I want a seat at the head table, right next to the family. And I want you to introduce me to Isabella and her father as your successful sister who is a partner at this firm. They exchanged glances. I could see the wheels turning in their heads. They thought I was still that desperate girl craving their validation. They thought I wanted to be part of their world again, that I was using my power just to force my way back into their good graces. They thought they could charm me, manipulate me, and eventually discard me again once the wedding was secure. Done, Kevin said, a relieved smile breaking across his face. Of course, Elena, we would love to have you. Perfect, I said, standing up and gathering my things. I will see you at the Grand Plaza. I walked out of the room without looking back. They had no idea that I did not want a seat at the table to join them. I wanted a front row seat to watch them burn. The Grand Plaza Hotel had not changed, but the scale of the deception certainly had. The engagement party for Kevin and Isabella was designed to eclipse the 30th anniversary disaster, a spectacle of white roses and crystal chandeliers that screamed desperate opulence. 300 guests filled the ballroom, a mix of old Chicago money and the new tech elite Kevin was trying so hard to impress. I arrived late, a calculated move to ensure all eyes were on the entrance. I wore a gown of midnight black velvet that hugged every curve, a stark, funereal contrast to the sea of pastels and creams in the room. Around my neck hung a necklace of flawless diamonds, stones so clear and heavy they made the paste jewelry my mother wore look like costume props from a high school play. Walking beside me was Victoria Vance, the Iron Lady of Finance. Her presence at my side sent a shockwave through the room. I saw heads turn and whispers spread like wildfire. To have Victoria Vance vouch for you was worth more than any bank statement. My parents and Kevin descended on us immediately, their smiles plastered on with terrifying precision. They played the role of the loving family to perfection. Elena, darling, my mother exclaimed, reaching out to embrace me but carefully avoiding touching my dress. We are so proud you could make time in your busy schedule to welcome your new sister. Kevin clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. He introduced me to everyone within earshot as his successful sister who had just returned from managing international accounts. It was nauseating, but I played along, offering a cool, detached smile. I spent the first hour circulating, using Victoria's gravity to pull me into the orbit of the most important man in the room, Isabella's father. He was a formidable man, a real estate tycoon who smelled weakness like a shark smells blood. I accepted a glass of champagne from him and lowered my voice conspiratorially. It is brave of you to back Kevin's venture so aggressively, I said, swirling my drink. Most investors are pulling back from tech startups with such volatile cash flows, but I suppose family supports family, regardless of the risk. He frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. Volatile, Kevin assured me the quarterly returns were steady. I feigned surprise. Oh, I must have misread the preliminary reports. I am sure it is fine. Just standard startup chaos. I watched the seed of doubt take root in his eyes before I excused myself. I made my way to the audiovisual booth at the back of the room. The technician was distracted by his phone. With a sleight of hand I had practiced a dozen times. I swapped the USB drive labeled Kevin and Isabella Memories with an identical drive I had pulled from my clutch. At 8:00, the lights dimmed. My father walked onto the stage, tapping the microphone. He launched into a speech that was almost a verbatim copy of the one he gave 3 years ago. He praised Kevin as a visionary, a king among men, the savior of the Sterling legacy. Then, he looked down at the podium. He could not resist. The urge to belittle me was woven into his DNA. "We are so glad everyone is here," Robert said, his eyes locking on mine with a malicious twinkle. Even those who usually just take up space found a way to contribute today. A few people chuckled nervously, but most stayed silent, sensing the tension. My mother smirked behind her napkin. I set my glass down on the table with a sharp click. This was it. I walked up the stairs to the stage. The room went deadly quiet. My father looked confused as I gently took the microphone from his hand. I turned to the crowd, my smile dazzling, my eyes dead cold. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady over the speakers. "Your words 3 years ago changed my life. You said some kids make you proud, and others just take up space. Today, I want to give you and Kevin a gift that finally reflects Kevin's true value to this family and to the world." I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. Behind me, the massive projection screen flickered to life, but instead of a montage of romantic photos set to sentimental music, a forensic accounting spreadsheet appeared. It was 10 feet high, glowing with rows of angry red numbers. The title at the top read, "Nebula Tech, Insolvency Analysis and Evidence of Wire Fraud, Charts of Illegal Money Laundering, Credit Card Statements Showing Gambling Debts in Las Vegas," and the undeniable proof of a Ponzi scheme filled the screen. The room gasped as one collective entity. I looked at Kevin's face, watching his soul leave his body, and then I turned back to my parents. "Now," I asked into the microphone, "who is the one taking up space?" The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and dropped glasses. The screen behind me was a towering monument to their greed, displaying row after row of red numbers that danced like flames. The text was large enough for even the guests in the back to read, detailing tax evasion, forgery of federal documents, and the complete embezzlement of a family trust fund. Kevin let out a feral scream. He lunged toward the stage, his face twisted in panic, desperate to rip the cords from the projector and plunge the room back into ignorance. But he never made it. 2 massive security guards, men I had personally hired and stationed in the wings, stepped forward and intercepted him. They held him back easily as he thrashed and cursed, reducing the golden boy to an impotent, flailing child. I did not flinch. I kept my posture rigid and my voice steady. I treated the breakdown of their lives like a shareholder meeting. I pointed the laser pointer at a specific cluster of transactions on the screen. "As you can see from line item 42, I explained, my voice cutting through the noise. The capital raised for research and development was immediately siphoned into personal accounts held by Robert and Linda Sterling. They were not just bystanders. They were active accomplices in defrauding investors to fund a lifestyle they could no longer afford." Isabella's father stood up, knocking his chair over with a crash. He was a man who terrified boardrooms, and now his fury was focused entirely on my family. He bellowed that the engagement was terminated immediately and that his legal team would be filing fraud charges before the night was over. Isabella did not wait for the lawyers. She marched up to the edge of the stage where Kevin was being restrained. With a swing that would have made a professional athlete proud, she slapped him across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She then ripped the massive diamond engagement ring from her finger and hurled it, not at Kevin, but at my mother. It struck Linda on the cheek, leaving a red welt. Then, the tragedy turned physical. My father, Robert, clutched his chest. His face turned a shade of gray that makeup could not mimic. He gasped for air and collapsed onto the stage floor. This was not the theatrics he had pulled in my apartment 3 years ago. This was a genuine coronary event brought on by the sudden, violent destruction of his ego. Yet, the horror was that no one rushed to help him. The guests, the elite of Chicago, simply raised their smartphones higher, recording his agony for their social media feeds. My mother let out a shriek that sounded less like grief and more like madness. She locked eyes with me, her face contorted with pure hatred. She charged up the stairs, her hands curled into claws, aiming for my throat. I did not run. I simply waited until she was inches away and then stepped lightly to the left. Momentum did the rest. She tripped over the hem of her expensive gown and sprawled face first onto the hardwood floor, landing in a heap of silk and humiliation at my feet. The heavy doors of the ballroom burst open. A squad of economic crime officers, whom I had notified exactly 1 hour prior, marched in. They moved with efficiency, pulling Kevin's arms behind his back and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The click of the metal was the only sound that penetrated the murmurs of the crowd. I stood alone at the microphone, looking down at the wreckage. My father was gasping on the floor. My mother was sobbing into the carpet, and my brother was being read his rights. I gripped the stand one last time. "This is the price," I said, my voice echoing through the stunned hall, "of underestimating a child you deemed a waste of space." I stepped down from the stage and walked up the center aisle. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. I did not look back at the flashing lights of the paramedics or the police. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the sirens and the ruins of the Sterling dynasty behind me. For the 7 days following the gala, the Sterling name was not just mud, it was radioactive. The scandal dominated the headlines, with every major news outlet dissecting the anatomy of the fraud I had exposed. The stock prices of the companies associated with Kevin's venture plummeted, wiping out millions of dollars in value overnight. It was a domino effect of catastrophic proportions, and I watched every piece fall with a calm, detached satisfaction. The banks moved with predatory speed. Since my parents had leveraged every asset they owned to back Kevin's house of cards, there was no mercy. The foreclosure notices were immediate. I read the reports from my private investigators detailing how the marshals arrived at the estate. They seized the luxury cars first, towing away the symbols of their vanity. Then they evicted my parents, giving them less than 24 hours to vacate the premises. Kevin was denied bail. He was currently sitting in a crowded county jail cell, facing a sentence of 10 years for wire fraud and embezzlement. Because all their assets were frozen or seized, my parents could not afford a high-powered defense attorney. The golden boy was left to the mercy of an overworked public defender who likely viewed him as just another spoiled con artist. Robert did not fare well. The heart attack on stage had turned out to be a massive stroke. He survived, but he was discharged from the hospital paralyzed on the left side of his body. He was confined to a wheelchair, his speech slurred and broken, with no money and no home. They were forced to rent a basement apartment in a neighborhood far worse than the one I had lived in when they disowned me. It was damp, infested with roaches, and smelled of despair. My mother, the woman who once claimed that wearing last season's fashion was a tragedy, was now the sole breadwinner. She found a job washing dishes at a Greasy Spoon diner, earning minimum wage to pay for Robert's medication and the bus fare to visit Kevin in jail. Her hands, once manicured and soft, were now chapped and raw from harsh detergents. I observed all of this from a distance. I did not intervene. I did not offer charity. I simply read the weekly updates from my detective and filed them away. Then came the final twist of the knife. The bank put the Sterling estate up for auction to recoup their losses. Because of the scandal and the hasty sale, the asking price was a fraction of its true value. I utilized a shell company with a nondescript name to place the winning bid. I bought my childhood home for pennies on the dollar. I moved back into the mansion 2 months later. My first act as owner was a total renovation. I stripped the wallpaper, tore up the carpets, and sold every piece of furniture that my parents had touched. I painted the walls in cool, neutral tones and filled the rooms with modern, minimalist art. I erased their existence from the property completely. It was no longer the Sterling family home. It was my fortress. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from the security desk at Apex Horizon Solutions. "There is a woman here named Linda Sterling," the guard said, his voice hesitant. "She is on her knees in the lobby. Ma'am, she is begging to see you. She says she is your mother." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office on the 30th floor. I looked down at the street below, where the people looked like tiny, insignificant insects scurrying in the rain. "I do not have a mother," I replied calmly. "Remove her from the premises." I stayed at the window. watching. A few minutes later, I saw a small, disheveled figure being escorted out of the building by two large guards. She looked frail and defeated, standing in the downpour as the automatic doors slid shut, barring her from the world she used to rule. I placed my hand against the cold glass, expecting to feel a pang of guilt, but my chest was empty. The winter outside was cold, but the winter inside me was colder. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow was falling heavily over Chicago, blanketing the city in a deceptive silence. I was sitting alone in the grand dining room of the estate, enjoying a glass of vintage red wine and a steak cooked to perfection. The house was quiet, stripped of the gaudy gold decorations my mother had loved so much, replaced by sleek, modern lines and the warmth of a real fire crackling in the hearth. I was finally at peace. Then, the doorbell rang. I checked the security monitor. Two figures stood huddled against the iron gate, shivering in the biting wind. It took me a moment to recognize them. They looked 20 years older than when I had last seen them at the engagement party. My mother, Linda, was wrapped in a thin, threadbare coat, her face gaunt and gray. Beside her, my father, Robert, sat slumped in a rusted manual wheelchair, a blanket draped over his paralyzed legs. They looked like ghosts of the people who had once ruled this city. I buzzed the gate open and met them at the front door. As they stepped into the foyer, the warmth of the house seemed to hit them physically. They looked around with wide, hungry eyes, taking in the marble floors and the expensive art. This was the home they had lost, the home they had destroyed, now perfected by the daughter they had discarded. "Please, Elena," my mother whispered, her voice cracking. "We have nowhere else to go. The shelter is full. It is freezing out there." I led them into the living room, the same room where they had once sipped champagne and laughed at my expense. I did not offer them a seat. I stood by the fireplace looking down at them. My father tried to speak. The stroke had left his face sagging on one side, and his words were slurred. "Elena," he stammered, "I always loved you. We just wanted the best. I am sorry." I watched him struggle, feeling absolutely nothing. It was amazing how quickly love returned when they were cold and hungry. "I know why you are here," I said, cutting off his pathetic apology. "You want help. You want money. And you want me to save Kevin." My mother fell to her knees, sobbing. "He is dying in there, Elena. He is not built for prison. You have the power." "You know the law better than anyone. Please, get him out." I walked over to the coffee table and placed two items on the glass surface. The first was a thick legal folder. The second was a single silver key. "I have been busy," I said softly. They looked at the items, confused. I pointed to the folder. "This file contains new evidence. It is a procedural error I discovered in the prosecution's case against Kevin. If submitted to the appellate court, it is highly likely his sentence will be reduced to time served. He could be out in 6 months." My mother gasped, reaching for it, but I pulled it back. I pointed to the key. "And this is the key to a fully furnished 2-bedroom apartment in the city. The rent has been paid in full for 1 year. It has heat, hot water, and a stocked fridge." Their eyes lit up with a feral kind of hope, but then I dropped the hammer. "However," I continued, my voice hardening, "I am not a charity. I am a businesswoman. So, we are going to make a deal. You can have one of these items, but not both." The room went deadly silent. The fire popped, a loud sound in the stillness. What my mother breathed. "You have to choose," I said, leaning in close. "You can take the file and save Kevin. If you do that, I will shred the lease for the apartment, and you two will go back out into the snow tonight with nothing. You will freeze, but your precious son will be free." I paused to let that sink in. "Or," I said, "you take the key, you get a warm home, food, and comfort for a year. But if you take the key, I burn this file right now. Kevin stays in prison for 10 years, and he faces it alone." My father made a choking sound. "Elena, you cannot." "That is your brother. It is a simple choice." "Dad," I said coldly. "Who do you love more, Kevin, or yourselves?" I stepped back and crossed my arms. "Choose. Now." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I watched their eyes dart back and forth between the folder and the key. This was the ultimate test. They had spent their entire lives sacrificing me to elevate Kevin. They claimed he was the sun and the moon. Surely, they would sacrifice their own comfort to save him now. My father looked at my mother. He was shivering, his paralyzed hand twitching in his lap. He looked at the snow swirling outside the window, then back at the warm fire. "Linda," he wheezed, "I cannot survive another night out there." My mother looked at the file that held her son's freedom. Then she looked at the key that promised her own survival. Her face twisted in a battle between maternal instinct and self-preservation. It lasted only 10 seconds. With a trembling hand, Linda reached out. She did not reach for the file. She grabbed the silver key and clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. "I am sorry, Kevin," she whispered to the air, her voice shaking. "I am so sorry. They had abandoned their golden child to save their own skins." A dark smile spread across my face. I started to laugh. It was a sharp, victorious sound that echoed off the marble walls of the silent house. My parents stared at me in horror, clutching the silver key like a talisman, unable to comprehend my amusement. I had just proven the one truth that had gnawed at me for years. Their love for Kevin was not unconditional. It was transactional. And when the currency was their own comfort, they went bankrupt instantly. I picked up the heavy legal folder from the table and flipped it open, revealing stacks of blank printer paper. "This file is a fake," I said, watching the color drain from my mother's face. "There is no new evidence. There is no loophole. Kevin is going to prison, and nothing on this earth can save him. I just wanted to see how ruthless you really were. I wanted to see if you would sell your golden child for a warm radiator and a soft bed." My mother let out a scream of pure despair. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had just damned her soul for nothing. She lunged for the folder, but I stepped back. I snapped my fingers, and 2 large security guards stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. "Get them out of here," I ordered. The guards grabbed my parents by their arms. As they were dragged toward the door, my father began to weep, a broken, pathetic sound. My mother screamed curses at me, her mask of civility finally gone. When they reached the front porch, I followed them out. I took the silver key from my pocket, the duplicate I had held onto, and tossed it into the deep snowdrift at the bottom of the steps. "That is the last thing you will ever get from me," I said, my voice cutting through the wind. "Find it if you want to survive the winter, but never come back here." I slammed the heavy oak door shut, and the sound was final. It was the sound of a book closing. The silence that followed was not lonely. It was liberating. The next morning, the news anchors announced the verdict. Kevin was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. My parents moved into the small, paid-for apartment. But their life was a living hell. Reports from my investigators told me they spent their days screaming at each other, blaming one another for the choice they made that Christmas Eve. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, fueled by regret and poverty. My life, however, moved only upward. Within a year, I was named the managing partner of Apex Horizon Solutions, becoming the youngest person and the first woman to hold the title. But success without purpose is hollow. I established the Elena Sterling Foundation, a scholarship fund dedicated specifically to students who had been disowned or abandoned by their families. I wanted to ensure that no other child would ever have to sleep in a car and feel like they did not belong. The story ends on a warm evening in late spring. We were holding a celebration on the rooftop terrace of the firm. A young intern, a girl with shy eyes and a brilliant mind who had come up through my scholarship program, approached me. She held a glass of sparkling cider and looked at me with genuine admiration. "Thank you, Ms. Sterling," she said softly. "You gave me a chance when no one else would." I smiled at her, and this time, the smile reached my eyes. It was not the cold sneer I had worn for my family. It was real. "You earned it," I replied. I walked to the edge of the balcony and looked out over the glittering skyline of Chicago. The city lights stretched out like a sea of diamonds. I took a sip of my wine and thought back to that night at the Grand Plaza, to the cruel words my father had spoken. He was wrong. No one is a waste of space if they have the courage to carve out their own place in the world, and I had carved mine out of stone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment down below telling me where you are listening from so we can connect and share our experiences. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people